By the Book on BFM 89.9.
Hello and welcome to By the Book with Sharmilla Ganesan and my co-conspirator in reading, Lynn. Have I used that one before?
You have, but I love it. All right, so today what we've got for you is we're speaking with Tash Aw, author of books such as The Harmony Silk Factory, 5-Star Billionaire, and now We the Survivors, which is a book that kind of captures the story and circumstances of one man driven to commit a violent crime and then the aftermath of that.
Hi Tash, thanks for joining us on the line. So this is the first of your novels to be set squarely in the Malaysia of today, So what led you to wanting to explore this particular place and time at this point in your career?
It's actually the second, because 5-Star Billionaire was
sort of semi.
it was Malaysia and Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
It was contemporary to the time. This one, I just felt that I wanted to concentrate. I started out wanting to write a tiny novel. I always do this. I always start out thinking I'm going to write a beautiful little novel. It's going to be, 160 pages, 150. And so I really wanted to write a small portrait of one man's life. And I started writing it, and, within, I guess, a few months, I realized that, it really needed to be a bigger story. And annoyingly, this always happens to me. Then the novel starts to grow and grow and grow. And then suddenly, before I know it, it's 300 pages. I wanted it to have that kind of, that very close proximity to a particular place, a particular geographical location. And in this case, it's the area just north of Klang. It's Kuala Selangor and all the little villages in between the coastline, the Selangor coastline. I wanted it to have a feeling of claustrophobia, of being trapped in a place, which is basically, it mirrors Ahok's life. Ahok is the principal character. And so I guess all that demanded that, if I was going to be true to this person's life, he's not a person who's traveled very much at all. I mean, he's lived for a few years in KL, but that's it. And I really wanted to show how, for those of us who live in KL, it just seems like that is the whole universe. And, if we want to go to Terengganu for a weekend, we can do that. If we want to go to see friends in Penang, we can do that. But for a lot of people, that's not the case. Malaysia is not a big country, but people still feel trapped by economic circumstances, by social circumstances. And so because I wanted to be true to his life, I felt I needed just to stay in that location.
I'm curious about what led you to want to write a portrait of this particular man's life. Was it, what was the spark that kind of led to it? Was it somebody that you saw? Was it someone you spoke to? Or was he just somebody who kind of entered your head fully formed with this life?
Well, I think it's just someone who we all know. I mean, someone we're all attached to, someone who is even part of our own families. A lot of us, most people in KL, even who live very middle class lives in KL, of my generation, say I'm now 47, will come from families who've come from the countryside, will come from families who still have relatives in the kampungs, and who actually don't enjoy anything close to the privileges that we have in KL and PJ. And so I guess, the fact that we live this slightly fractured lifestyle was the fact that it was what drove me to write about this man, who's basically, a very ordinary man. He represents, I guess, the majority of Malaysians. He's not starving. He's not destitute. He has work. He has income. But he is the average Malaysian for whom life is tough. He has a salary, but it's really difficult to make ends meet. And more than that, he's starting to find that, that sort of narrative, that Asian narrative of if you just work hard, you don't complain, you just, get on with your life and you just work hard, things will turn out really well for you. And, you might become really, really rich. You might become a billionaire. He's starting to find, like a lot of people, that is not true. that is not going to happen for him. There's so much talk in Malaysia about what it means to be middle class. What it means to have an income of 2,000 or 3,000 ringgit in KL. Like, is that enough to live in KL? So, for the most people find that it's tough to get by. They're not dying, but they're surviving. And that's why, I just wanted to try and explore what it was to live that kind of life. And also, if you don't have the privileges of education that we have, I think, most of us, people who work at BFM, People who who live in the literary world, who work in banks and work in law firms, they have an education, and education gives you choice. Whereas if you don't have that education, what are your choices?
And almost as a contrast to Ahok, you have the character Sumin, who I found quite interesting because she's that sort of
Urbanite.
Yeah, that urbanite. But in a way, she's also framing the story for us because she's sort of interviewing him to get his narrative. What made you decide to do that, to frame that story through her perspective?
Because I wanted to implicate myself in the story, I wanted to implicate the reader in the story. Sumin is basically us. Sumin is tertiary level educated, primarily English speaking. She's very well meaning. She's plugged into the issues of her country, but there is a big divide. She really wants to understand, what drove Ahok to do the things that he did, what drove him to commit a crime, commit a racist crime, even though he himself does not consider himself racist. And so it's this act of understanding that I found the most important, probably the most important thing in the whole of the novel, because it shows what a divide there is now between someone in Malaysia who has an education and someone who does not have an education, and the choices, the life choices that are available to them. We are all part of that society. We are all part of that social dynamic. So I wanted us to feel as if we were in her place. So we're trying to understand, but actually, do we understand? Actually, is it possible to reconcile ourselves with all the other parts of Malaysian society? And I don't have the answers, and the novel is a series of questions. Sumin really tries her best, but as you point out, she is framing the thing first. So whose story is it? He has this great story. He's very intelligent. He's very sensitive. But she's the one who has the education. She's the one who has the grammar. She has the vocabulary. She has a sense of how to write a book, which he does not. So she's the one whose voice dominates the story. In fact, she tries to pull herself out of it and give him the space to talk. But ultimately, she is in control of the narrative. And when he addresses her, he's saying you all the time. I wanted it for the reader to feel as if he's addressing us directly.
So that is interesting because when you yourself write this story, it kind of fits into this conversation that we are having today in the literary scene about who gets to tell stories. How do you represent a narrative that is not your own, an experience that you may be very removed from? How do you deal with this balance about, talking about an experience with both honesty and authenticity?
Well, I think by being honest in positioning yourself in and around the issue. Although I have to say, for in this particular story, if we're being honest, there are a lot of people. The whole narrative of Malaysia now is that we are really, the people of certainly my generation, who have certain kinds of jobs. That we're all really, we're always like this. We're always rich. We're always bourgeois. We're always middle class. But actually, we examine ourselves. Actually, most of us come from very humble backgrounds. We come from backgrounds actually not so dissimilar to that of Ahok's. And if we don't personally, we certainly know a lot of people very close to us. We have relatives like that. We have schoolmates like that. And so it doesn't take a big leap. We are really part of that dynamic. Most people in my generation, we all went to government schools. Private schools didn't really exist in a meaningful way then. So, even people who considered themselves well off and middle class or whatever, they sent their kids to the local government school where there was a very, very big mix of people, where there were a mix of people, who grew up in Damansara Heights and people who came from much poorer backgrounds, whose mothers were domestic help, whose parents lived on the edge of an estate, a rubber estate. So, that experience is part of our shared growing up. That experience is part of our shared heritage. So, I don't like the pretense nowadays that a lot of people have of there are two separate stories. In Malaysia, we're very close to each other's stories. So there is the shared experience. But the wider issue of whose story is it to tell is, of course, it's a relevant one. But I feel that in general, it's the writer's job to make leaps of understanding, to make leaps of empathy. There are responsibilities involved, and you need to be aware of them. And in the writing of them, of any story, I think the reader can tell whether or not the writer is being responsible in in her understanding or his understanding of the subject.
With us today is Tash Aw, the author of We the Survivors, which is the book that we're discussing today. Up next, we continue our conversation with Tash. Keep it here on By the Book, BFM 89.9.
Best flipping moments. BFM 89.9, the business station.
Welcome back to By the Book with Sharmilla and Lynn. And with us over Skype today is Tash Aw, and we are talking about his latest book called We the Survivors.
So, Tash, one of the things that I wanted to ask you really was, you mentioned earlier that sense of claustrophobia, that sense of being stuck. And that's very, pervasive throughout the book as you read it. And the character of Ahok goes through a lot of it, financially and socioeconomically driven, but a lot of it also kind of spilling out into personal relationships, into romantic relationships. And a lot of it is actually very terribly heartbreaking, but it is described generally in a rather matter-of-fact tone. Can you talk to us about that idea? Because we were talking about who gets to tell this story, whose language is it? And the tone of it is very sort of, and then this happened. And I'm curious about that.
Well, I think it's because it's to do with the way I see class in Malaysia. When people pretend there's no class in Malaysia, but there is. It's something that developed very quickly over the last, 2 or 3 decades. And I think that when you look at people whose lives are materially hard, who don't have the luxury of, regular income, who don't have the luxury of, being able to go to restaurants when they want to, who don't have to worry about their home loan repayments. It's a very different dynamic. The amount of time you have to interrogate your own emotions is not the same. I remember that when I did this is years ago, when I did a festival in a panel in Singapore. People were saying how there are all these sort of there's a lot of talk about Malaysian writers and the things they're doing and Asian writers in general. And someone slightly aggressively said, what I want to know is why in all these novels there's so much suffering. Why isn't there any talk of love? Why don't we explore beautiful, loving relationships more? And my father, who really does not come from a cultivated, elegant, book-loving family, who had a very, very tough upbringing, unusually in the audience that day, afterwards told me, well, the thing is, people like me, people like your mother, we don't have time for love. We didn't have time for love.
Oh.
And it really, really struck me really hard because I knew that was not true. I knew that they do love each other. They have always loved each other. And actually, in the stories they told each other about, when they were first going out and first dating, of course you can see how much they loved each other. The fact they've been together for all that time meant they've loved each other. But the way they express love is not the same as the way love is expressed between two people of a deeply bourgeois, middle class, cultured family. They don't take each other out to the opera and or a concert and go for a fancy dinner afterwards. I mean, these are not the way. That is not the way they express love. And so there, in the book, there is one point in which Ahok said when his father goes away to look for work in Singapore and he doesn't come back, and his mother is watching Chinese soap opera on TV, and it's very syrupy and loving, and she says, basically, I wish we had time to love like that, to live like that. And, Ahok sort of thinks about it and says, for him, for his family, for his parents, separation is love, loneliness is love. There are other expressions of love. And so, a lot of, Ahok's life is an expression of just what happens because he doesn't have time to reflect on how he's being turfed out from one job to another. If you have a really fancy job in a law firm in KL and you have that and it's your life, it's so secure. You have a degree from a fancy university abroad and you come back and you have this job and it's basically you kind of breeze into that job. You almost feel entitled to have that job, which doesn't mean you don't have to work hard. You have to work hard. But if for some reason you get fired, it's like this incredible shock. It's, you take weeks to get over it. You take weeks to digest that information. The mechanics are that you will get you will probably get severance pay. You will probably have, a house to live in. The stress doesn't immediately come as to how you're going to repay, how you're going to pay for meals that day. Whereas if you're someone in Ahok's position, you're working tables, you're running a restaurant, a small restaurant somewhere, you get sacked the next day. You're thinking, how am I going to live? Where's the money coming from? So that whole shock, that personal shock about what does this mean to me? What does this mean to me as a person? I mean, they don't have time to. He doesn't have time to think about that. So he just has to get on with it.
And a lot of, I think, the reason why this book hits home is also because the descriptions of the places that Ahok occupies are very deeply felt, all the way from sort of the fishing village that he grows up in to the more middle-class tamans eventually that he gets to. How did you do the research really in terms of being able to so squarely place these characters in very specific spots?
Just by being aware and sensitive, but I know tons of people. Loads of my relatives live in all of those, very typical tamans. I mean, everyone has relatives or friends who live in those areas, and certainly people in my generation do. And I guess if you're just sensitive to the way other people live, you will know exactly how any kind of person lives anywhere. But the whole thing about tamans are not so far removed from even the fanciest neighborhood. You just have to drive half a mile down the road, or like even less than that, and you will find yourself in one of those estates. And when we tend to think of them as different now, but actually, a lot of PJ has had that feeling in the 1980s. It wasn't so different, and then the villagers. I have a lot of family who come from those kind of villages, so it's not really, it's not that difficult. And that, I guess, is interesting. The fact that we're having this conversation now, journalists abroad ask me this question. I can kind of understand that, but it's slightly more surprising that this conversation exists now in Malaysia, which goes to show how much certain portions of the society in Malaysia have progressed in the last 20 years, and how, therefore, that experience of education, that experience of affluence has removed quite a few people who live in KL from the experience of most of the rest of the country, which is actually an experience very close to theirs. And so, just sort of an extension of what you were asking me earlier about, the matter-of-factness of the way Ahok speaks, is that for a lot of people in Malaysia and actually in the rest of Asia and the rest of the world who live lives that are objectively quite hard, they normalize that hardship, they normalize that suffering. So to them, it's not hard. It's just normal. That is what, and he thinks the way a lot of people think, which is that, well, it's tough. That's my lot in life. I wasn't good at school. My parents were fishermen. What can I expect? And that's something I find very poignant, because there was a time in Malaysian society and Asian society in general where there was a sense of optimism. There was a sense of, you could do anything you want. But now I think that upward trajectory, I don't think is as obvious as it was before.
On that note, one of the terms that I kept coming across as I was doing a bit of research on We the Survivors is that it was described as anti-nostalgic. And it struck me that this is actually a term that we could more broadly apply to actually all of your novels. What does anti-nostalgia sort of mean to you,
I don't know. It's really funny because people, I get a lot of response saying it's so bleak. I mean, I wish it was a bit more uplifting, which I think probably goes to show what sort of person I am, because I actually personally think these stories are quite uplifting. I think.
Well, anti-nostalgia isn't necessarily a negative, though, I think. It strikes me as that clear-eyed view that you were talking about earlier.
I mean, I guess I want to be sort of quite real about the way I look at stuff, which is not to say that I don't make stuff up. I don't give my my characters certain things that just come purely from the imagination. But what I want is, I want there to be a sense of really grappling with these issues. For me, writing a novel is often a way of wrestling with issues myself and trying to ask myself a series of questions in the writing of a novel, and maybe trying to work through them, if not actually answer them in the writing of the novel, which is why I think my novels rarely give you that sense at the end of the novel that everything has been answered, every single question is there, it has been resolved, and that you get to the end of the novel and the whole world is right, has been put to right, and that there is this fully satisfactory, fully kind of formed ending that gives you what we come to think of in storytelling terms as closure. Everyone now thinks of closure. We've watched so many Hollywood movies, we've watched so much TV that we need closure. But actually, life is not about closure. Life is about open-endedness. Life is about unresolved stuff. Life is about relationships that don't end well, and you break up with someone, and we're supposed to, in modern storytelling terms, think that means it's done with, that relationship is done, and you process that information yourself and then you move on. But actually, the truth is that we break up with someone and we cannot stop thinking, we cannot stop obsessing about that person, and it bugs us. We get hooked up with someone else and it still bugs us. And I guess that sense of life being always questioning and always being questioned is something that fills my novels. It's what, to me, the writing process is about. And so readers, I think, quite enjoy that sensation of being taken on a journey and taken into deeper and deeper into a set of questions in which they're examining the world around them, the world they live in, and beyond that. But they might not necessarily get the answers to that journey. They might not get the payoff at the end.
Thank you so much, Tash.
Thank you, Sharmilla. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you both.
And on that perfect note about endings, we've been speaking today to Tash Aw about his latest book, We the Survivors. Weigh in. Have you read it? Would you like to read it? You can email us at buythebook@bfm.my. You can tweet us at BFM Radio. You can WhatsApp us at 018-789-8899. We come to Footnotes.
Yes, we do.
And because We the Survivors was in so many ways about a character that really existed on the periphery of society, we thought it'd be interesting to talk about one character that each of us picked, who we would also call outsiders in many ways.
Because there is a rich tradition and a rich history of outsider characters in literature, isn't there? I mean, in many ways, the idea of people standing apart from society or somehow ostracized makes for a very interesting entry point into observing society, into telling a story, because they are somewhat removed, right? And we did speak in detail earlier with Tash about his character Ahok. And so we thought, why not? Why not kind of go back to our bookshelves and take a look at other people who have done the same?
So one of the characters that always comes to mind, and in a weird way, it's because of the movie adaptation of the book, is Holly Golightly from Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Yes.
Famously written by Truman Capote.
Wider than a mile, I'm crossing you in style.
I don't know whether Holly is the kind of person that would automatically come to mind when you talk about outsider characters, primarily because the movie has reimagined her in a way where she becomes so aspirational.
And that is one of the things that you gain and you lose, right? When you have a character played by a screen presence as charismatic.
Hepburn.
Exactly. So when you have Audrey Hepburn, glamour is almost par for the course. You know, there are still people to this day obsessed with her shade of lipstick, because a girl always needs a little bit of lipstick before she faces such things.
Right.
And, you're right, though. When you think about what Holly actually is and who she is as she is written, then, I mean, she is very much standing on that periphery.
So I watched the movie first before I read the book. And when I got to the book, I realized how particular Holly was to that time, and how a woman who lived as she did, not making it her aim in life to find a man, living on her own terms, defining what she defines, defining what emotions are for herself. These are things that made her an outsider. It made her an outsider, and that's particularly why she ends up connecting with the unnamed narrator in the book, who in the movie becomes her love interest eventually. But what I liked about the book is the fact that that's not how it plays out, because at the end of the day, both of them are outsiders in some ways. Many people think that the male character is actually a stand-in for Capote himself, who, as a gay man, also knew what it was like to be an outsider. So I love that this book, which has now become, so associated with New York and little black dresses and pearls, is essentially about a woman who was very much an outsider, but then was intentionally so, who chose to live that way.
Outsider on her own terms,
Yes.
right? There is a difference between somebody who has been kicked out and somebody who's like, oh, I don't like playing by your rules.
Exactly.
Is this how it works? Well, I'm not keen, so I'm going to step aside.
Yeah.
And that is very much the Holly Golightly vibe. It's like, well, yes, I may make up names and, yes, I may sleep in, and yes, I will do all these things that aren't expected of a woman, but it's just how I like it.
Yeah.
Holly, I'm in love with you.
So what?
So what? So plenty. I love you. You belong to me.
No. People don't belong to people.
Of course they do.
I'm not gonna let anyone put me in a cage.
I don't want to put you in a cage. I want to love you.
It's the same thing.
No, it's not. Holly,
I'm not Holly. I'm not Lula May either. I don't know who I am. I'm like Cat here. We're a couple of no-name slobs. We belong to nobody, and nobody belongs to us. We don't even belong to each other.
And she constantly talks about being stuck in a cage and about rules being cages.
And not being owned.
And not being owned, exactly. And it's that idea of not being owned that I loved from the book, which I realized the movie had dropped.
So it's interesting that you went with that particular character, Holly Golightly, because mine is from one of my favorite books of all time, but she is not one that I would necessarily recognize as a feminist hero, and that is Miss Jane Eyre.
Me she had dispensed from joining the group, saying, she regretted to be under the necessity of keeping me at a distance, but that until she heard from Bessie, and could discover by her own observation that I was endeavouring in good earnest to acquire a more sociable and childlike disposition, a more attractive and sprightly manner, something lighter, franker, more natural, as it were, she really must exclude me from privileges intended only for contented, happy little children.
When I first read Jane Eyre, I had one of those experiences where I just had to sit in silence for a little bit after because I was so affected by it. I finished it, I read it in gulps and swallows, and I just loved that book so much. And it very much tells the story of somebody who is on the outside of society, but, constantly referred to actually as plain, constantly referred to as, oh, you were there, I didn't see you. She has no status in society in a time where women without a family name, right? Women without money, women without that sort of backing just didn't have a future. She was a nanny, she was on her way out in the wilderness when she ran into a man. I mean, it can't get sort of more obvious than that, where you have a character who's always already been living on the outside. Then you put her out into the wilderness a little further and have her deal with the strangeness that is Mr. Rochester and his secrets and, all of his passions hidden and less so. And just, she is not Holly. And it might be a function of time as well, but I think in her heart of hearts, in her soul of souls, Jane Eyre is a different sort of outsider. She is not the kind of outsider who doesn't want to be owned. She is the kind of outsider who wants to feel, what is it that it says at the end? That they're joined at the side, that they're together, that she belongs, so that is a different sort of story, I suppose, with Jane Eyre. It instead speaks to the experience of somebody who has never belonged, who wants to belong. And yet, I think in her years of not belonging has fostered this really strong sense of self. I mean, she's a very timid character by and large. And generally in Jane Eyre, more things happen to her than not. But this whole spirit of somebody who is like, oh, this is the situation, I'm leaving. I don't want to be here, I'm going. Somebody who's not afraid I think, in some ways, to say no to situations that she can't bear, actually. There's something in that I found quite beautiful.
Jane, you must stay.
I've become nothing to you. Am I a machine without feelings? Do you think that because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, that I am soulless and heartless? I have as much soul as you and full as much heart. And if God had blessed me with beauty and wealth, I could make it as hard for you to leave me as it is for I to leave you. I'm not speaking to you through mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, as if we'd passed through the grave and stood at God's feet equal, as we are.
As we are.
I think it, despite you prefacing this by saying she's not a feminist hero, I think one of the things that is most interesting about Jane Eyre is the fact that her status as an outsider allows her to empathize and understand other outsider characters.
Yeah.
And in that way, she is like Holly in some ways, right? She's not horrified by Mr. Rochester's
she's not.
Place, where he is, what's happening, even with his, whole wife in the attic. I mean, I wouldn't say she takes it in stride, but she takes it at a much more, with much more openness than anyone else who lived at that time from her sort of station in life would.
Also, I think the only reason she could have any conversations with Mr. Rochester at all was because she was not interested in his money.
Yes.
She was not interested in, becoming the lady of that house. She was not interested in all the things that would go with that level of status. She just wanted to be seen. Mm-hmm. She just wanted to be seen as Jane to Edward. And I think since you've kind of blown the wife in the attic thing, Mr. Rochester...
Was that a spoiler?
At this point, I mean. But, Mr. Rochester at the end, firstly, also one of the great outsider characters, but also at the end he goes blind. Mm-hmm. And again, that sense of empathy that you're talking about, of somebody who's never been able to quite belong, I think, is what allows her, like you said, to see each situation without horror. And that's quite beautiful.
Tell us who your favorite outsider characters are and why they make novels so much more interesting. You can tweet us at BFM Radio. You can WhatsApp us at 018-789-8899 or write to us if you have anything longer to say at buythebook@bfm.my.